So for our 27th class, we created a timeline from the time period of 1789 to 1800. So if you were absent, this is what we did in class, and I started class with a big question. What is the best way to get a historical story across? Now, I feel this question transcends scale. What I mean by this is a U.S. history class. It works for this. If I was teaching world history, it works for that, or even a personal history. Let me give you a recent real-life example to illustrate my point. Here's a picture of my fishing trip. Now, this guy right here, I have known for 25 or 30 years. He was my teammate. We've traveled the country together. We know each other incredibly well. And I went fishing with his two workmates who I had never met before. And we spent a lot of time together. And when people mix, doesn't matter where you're from or how old you are, you get to know each other. And they were asking me questions about myself, all very normal. Now, I had a choice of how I answered: chronology, theme, or biography. And there's a time and a place for all three. Now, let's give the hypothetical. So tell me about yourself. And I use chronology. Well, I was born in 1974, and then I attended elementary school at Walnut Lake Elementary, and then I went to middle school at West Maple. That's weird. I think that would make me pretty awkward and cringy. Or I could go down thematic road. Well, I like fishing just like you. Let me tell you about my fishing trips. Yeah, I played rugby with Nate for a lot of years. I make my living as a school teacher. That's my job. That's a little more normal in this scenario. Or I could go down biography road and tell them about important people in my life. Well, my father was a big influence on me, as well as my high school track coach. Let me tell you about these guys. I'm married with 3 kids. Let me tell you about my wife and my kids. So in this case, thematic and biography is a little more normal and healthy than chronology, but there's a time and a place for chronology, okay? And it's fluid, and to really understand a historical story, you have to get it from all 3 levels, okay, if you follow me. Now, for today's class, we are going to go down chronology road. So if you were absent, please go to sutori.com, free site, get a login, that sort of thing. And we're going to be creating a timeline using pages 189 to 190. So if you were absent, sutori.com is the tool we used, and the pages are 189, 190, okay? So I'm going to go over the content. Now, if it's easy content, I'm going to breeze right through it. If it's a little more esoteric or new to you, I'll give you a quick blurb. But all of this stuff is in your book. You can use Google. Not difficult to acquire the knowledge, okay? So we started with 1789. New House and Senate are elected, and George Washington is elected and inaugurated as the first U.S. president. Now, a little trivia for you. People who want to be cutesy and trip you up, they say, who was the first president? Everyone goes, George Washington. Actually, it was John Hanson during the Articles of Confederation. So George Washington was our first elected president. There you go. Maybe that'll win you a bet in the future, okay? Pretty easy. Don't need to go into too much detail about that. 1790, federal government assumed state Revolutionary War debt called the Assumption Plan. States are pretty happy about that if you can get that. And Washington, D.C. is selected as the permanent U.S. capital. It's centrally located. That's why it was picked. It's centrally located near the water, so that's why it was picked. Again, pretty doable. Don't have to go into too much detail about that. 1790, also, a very important book was written by Judith Sargent Murray. It was called On the Equality of the Sexes. And this was even before Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she was saying, hey, women are equal to men. So we see the seeds of feminism being planted early on in our history. Now, 1791 is an important year. Holy shnikes, is it an important year. The Bill of Rights is ratified, and the first bank of the United States is chartered. These are game changers. Now, yesterday's class, you learned about the Bill of Rights. Don't have to go into that again. But the first bank of the U.S., this established a banking system to allow America to do its thing. Okay, for all you Hamilton fans, okay, you know what I'm talking about. I wish I could play Hamilton, but I can't. So if you're interested in that musical, it is worthwhile time. My kids sang it for years. I think I know every word to that musical. But I digress. Okay, moving on to 1791, or continuing 1791, the Ohio Indian tribes defeat U.S. Army in the Northwest Territory, and Hamilton issues his report on manufactures. Again, the Hamilton piece, having a banking system, was essential in America doing its thing. And the Indian tribes of the Northwest were winning at this juncture, but not for long. And moving on to 1793, Washington is re-elected president, and Citizen Genet arrives as ambassador to the United States. So Washington being re-elected was pretty much unanimous. He was such a respected figure. Now, this is a little more obscure. So Citizen Genet was the French envoy to the United States, and he was appointed during the French Revolution. Now, his actions on arriving in the United States led to a major political and international incident, which was called the Genet Affair. And here it is one more time. The Genet Affair forced the United States to formulate a consistent policy on the issue of neutrality. Washington's cabinet signed a set of rules regarding policies of neutrality, and these rules were formalized. Essentially, when is it time to sit out? Okay, there's a time to get involved and a time to not get involved. And America had to think about that. When do we get involved? When do we not? So it's important in that respect. 1793, the Whiskey Rebellion. So people who had a whiskey tax got really, really upset. Here's some whiskey drinkers tarring and feathering the tax collector. So Americans have a long history of not being real happy about being taxed. And think about this. The Revolutionary War was still in people's minds. And one of the reasons they fought was, taxation without representation, right? So they didn't like being taxed, and they felt it was kind of the repeat of the injustices of a few years prior. So hashtag too soon, if you follow that. So in 1794, Western Indian Confederacy is defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and Jay's Treaty between the USA and Britain. So I told you a couple minutes ago that eventually the Americans would defeat the Indians in this part of the country. And this treaty put things to rest, okay? Bear in mind, we had just fought the British. This said, hey, let's smooth it out. A détente, if you want to be more highbrow. And we were cool with Britain until 1812, but that's a different story. 1795, the Treaty of Greenville ends Indian wars on the Ohio frontier, and Pinckney's treaty with Spain. So the point of these two, as America is growing, we need to reestablish our borders. Okay, this used to be Indian territory, now it's America. As America was moving west, we didn't want to step on Spain's toes, and Pinckney made an arrangement so we didn't, not to tick off the Spanish, which is a good thing. Didn't want to do that. John Adams is elected in 1796. Imagine being the poor guy who has to take over after George Washington. Holy cow, that is tough. So he had really big shoes to fill. That was one of the more difficult scenarios to be brought into as a president, but you can figure that one out. 1797, the beginning of the quasi-war with France. And quasi is a prefix that means not full. It's like somewhat. Quasi. It's not 100%, but it's somewhat. It's not 100% war, but it's somewhat war. And this conflict was a limited naval war against French privateers who were seizing U.S. shipping in the Caribbean. This quasi-war is significant because it's the first seaborne conflict for the newly established Navy. And our Navy was essential in the growth of this country. It really is important. Having a strong military is essential to having a healthy country. 1798, the XYZ affair. And this is probably new to you, I'm guessing. So the XYZ affair involved an American peace delegation in France. 3 agents of the French foreign minister labeled X, Y, and Z in President John Adams' initial communications and with Congress, and the French foreign minister's demand for a bribe from the American delegation. So again, we're having some problems with France, our former ally. We're having a little falling out. YYZ, great song. That was in 1981. Has nothing to do with history, but if you've never checked out Rush, check them out. They're my favorite band. So see, XYZ sounds like YYZ. Get that? Yeah, it's also the international airport for Toronto. There you go. And then 1798 continues. Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Act, and Kentucky and Virginia declare this act unconstitutional, so some tensions from the state. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of 4 laws passed by the U.S. Congress in 1798 amid widespread fear that war with France was imminent. The 4 laws, which remain controversial to this day, restricted the activities of foreign residents in the country and limited freedom of speech of the press. And we're going to see this throughout U.S. history. In times of war, civil liberties can be diminished or go away, if you know anything about the Japanese internment camp in World War II and that sort of thing. But that's for another day. And then 1799, George Washington dies. Fair argument, without Washington, America wouldn't exist as we know it today. Great man. I feel he deserves the state, the capital, the quarter, the dollar. I think he deserves it all for what he did for this country, but that's just my opinion. And then 1800. Adams concludes peace with France and signs a Judiciary Act. Now, like I was saying in the prior slides, it was really close to getting ugly with France, and Adams smoothed it out. And I think it's lost to history. Adams was a great negotiator. He was an attorney before he was president, and he used those skills to smooth it out. So thank you, President Adams. And then the Judiciary Act was actually 1801. It started in 1800, and it reorganized the federal judicial branch by creating the nation's first circuit court judgeships. And you might, when you're looking this up, find midnight judges, and that relates to that, okay? Now, the last thing, the election of 1800 is so involved and I think very interesting to the point it warrants its own class. So we're going to have this class tomorrow, and believe it or not, that will end part 4, and then we'll move into part 3, excuse me, and then we're going to move into part 4 afterwards. So again, if you were absent, go to Satori, create the timeline using pages 189 to 190, and we'll be all good. So thank you for watching.